Mark stood in the middle of the quiet forest, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He had been hiking to clear his mind, hoping the peaceful surroundings would help him forget the chaos of his recent life. But peace was the last thing he felt when he saw her. She was standing near a fallen tree, her silver hair shimmering unnaturally under the dappled sunlight. Her eyes, an iridescent shade of violet, locked onto his, and Mark felt a chill run down his spine. She didn't look entirely human. Her skin had a faint, almost imperceptible glow, and the way she held herself was too calm, too controlled. "Mark," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a strange, echoing quality. He froze. "How do you know my name?" The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I know much more than your name." Mark felt his heart quicken. "Are you with the government? Is this some kind of surveillance thing?" he demanded, his voice rising. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I'm not from your government, Mark. I'm not even from your planet." Mark let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe that? What are you, some kind of cosplayer?" "Look, if this is a joke." "It's not a joke," she interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "I can prove it to you." Before Mark could respond, she began to speak, recounting details about his life that no stranger could possibly know. She described the time he broke his arm falling off his bike at age 8, how he used to hide in his grandmother's attic to avoid bullies, and even the song his mother used to hum to him when he couldn't sleep as a child. Mark's breath caught in his throat. How do you know all that?" "I told you, I'm not from here," she said. "My name is Sirith. My species has the ability to read the emotional echoes that linger around people. Your memories, your feelings, they leave a trace, and I can see it." Mark's instinct was to run, but something in her eyes held him in place. There was no malice, no trickery. She seemed genuine. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sirith hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "Because you're important, Mark. More important than you realize. And I need your help." The forest felt unnaturally silent around them, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Mark stared at Sirith, torn between disbelief and a strange, inexplicable pull toward her. "Help with what?" he finally asked. Her violet eyes softened, but her expression remained serious. "Saving my people. And maybe your own." Mark had no idea what he had just stepped into, but one thing was certain. His life was never going to be the same. Mark couldn't shake the weight of Sirith's words as he stared at her. The way she spoke, calm yet urgent, made it impossible to dismiss her entirely. Still, his mind rebelled against the idea. An alien, asking for his help. It sounded like something out of a cheap sci-fi movie. "You can't expect me to just believe you," Mark said, taking a cautious step back. His instincts told him to stay on guard, but his curiosity kept him rooted in place. "I know it's hard to accept," Sirith replied, her voice steady. "But I don't have the luxury of convincing you slowly. Time is running out for my people, and you're the key." Mark shook his head. "Why me? I'm nobody special. I'm just a guy who works a boring job and tries to get through the week without losing his mind. What could I possibly do for you?" Sirith's expression softened, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw sadness in her strange violet eyes. "You're more special than you realize, Mark. Humans, your kind, have something unique that my people lack. Something powerful." Mark folded his arms, trying to mask his unease with skepticism. "And what's that?" "Emotion," she said simply. Mark blinked. "Emotion. That's it. You came all this way to talk about feelings." Sirith gave a small, almost wistful smile. "It may sound trivial to you, but for us, it's everything. My people are different. We're advanced in many ways, but over time, we lost something essential. Our emotional spectrum faded, leaving us disconnected and vulnerable. Without it, We're dying, Mark. Mark tried to process her words, but they felt too big, too surreal. So, what? You're here to steal our emotions or something? No, Sereth said quickly, shaking her head. It's not about stealing. It's about understanding, connecting. You, Mark, have an unusually strong emotional resonance. Your experiences, your struggles, they've left imprints that I can feel, even from a distance. You're like a beacon, and that makes you unique. Mark felt a strange mix of flattery and discomfort. He had always seen his emotional baggage as a burden, not a gift. Okay, let's say I believe you for a second. What do you want me to do? Sereth stepped closer, her voice lowering, as if sharing a secret. There's a way to channel your resonance to stabilize my people's psychic energy. But it's dangerous, and it requires your cooperation. Dangerous how? Mark asked, his tone sharp. Sereth hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. If we fail, it could harm you. But if we succeed, you'll not only save my people but unlock something extraordinary for yours as well. Mark's head spun with questions, doubts, and a gnawing sense of inevitability. He didn't know if he could trust her, but deep down, he felt the pull of something bigger than himself. Fine, he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. I'll hear you out, but don't expect me to jump into this blindly. Sereth's face softened with relief. That's all I ask, Mark. Just listen. And I promise you'll understand why this matters. For the first time, Mark wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as ordinary as he thought. Mark had always thought he understood the world around him. He knew what made sense, what was possible. But standing there, in the presence of Sereth, he began to feel as if his understanding of reality was being torn apart, piece by piece. Sereth watched him closely, sensing his confusion. You don't have to believe everything all at once, Mark. I'll show you. With a slow, deliberate movement, she raised her hand. Mark blinked, and suddenly, the space around them began to shift. The trees, the forest, the sky, everything seemed to dissolve and blur, leaving them standing in the middle of a vast, empty space. It wasn't like any kind of hologram he had ever seen. This was real, yet not. In front of them, glowing light-formed shapes, buildings, streets, and skies. The image was so lifelike that Mark could almost smell the air, feel the breeze on his skin. He stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This is my world, Sereth said, her voice calm as the vision around them flickered. Or at least it was. Before the fade. Mark didn't know what to say. The world before him was stunning. Tall, shimmering towers reaching toward the sky. Massive gardens full of strange, luminous plants, and wide rivers that sparkled like silver. It was unlike anything on Earth, and yet it felt strangely familiar. The Enari people once lived here. Sereth continued, her gaze distant. We were a thriving civilization, full of innovation, beauty, and harmony. But over time, something happened. Our connection to emotions, the very thing that made us who we are, began to fade. We lost our ability to feel deeply, to connect with each other. We became hollow. Mark stared at the vision, his mind racing. But if this was your home, why isn't it like this anymore? Sereth sighed, her face filled with sorrow. The fade is a slow process, Mark. First, it affected our emotional range. Then it started taking our memories, our sense of self. Eventually, it will take everything. He could feel the sadness in her words, an emotion so powerful it almost made his chest ache. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for her. This alien woman, so far from his understanding of reality, was showing him her pain. How can I help? He asked, his voice softer than he intended. Sereth looked at him with a faint smile, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That's why I'm here. You have what we've lost. Your kind, humans, possess an emotional depth that we've forgotten. You're able to feel things deeply. Love, anger, fear, joy. These emotions are like lifeblood to us. And you, Mark, have a powerful resonance. You can help us regain what we've lost. Mark's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear. He wasn't sure what was going on, or why it felt like his life was about to change forever. But one thing was clear. Sereth wasn't lying. "I don't understand how this works," he admitted, still reeling from the experience. "You don't have to understand everything right now," she said gently. "But you will in time. Just know that you're important, Mark. Your emotions, your experiences, they're the key to saving my people. And maybe even saving yourself." The vision of Sereth's world flickered again, and suddenly they were back in the forest, standing under the trees. The sunlight had shifted, and the world around them was once again solid and real. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken an impossible turn. "Are you ready to begin?" Sereth asked, her gaze steady and calm. Mark didn't know what the future held. He didn't even know if he was ready. But somehow, deep down, he knew that the answers he was looking for lay in this strange, new path she had offered him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Mark stood in silence, the weight of Sereth's words still heavy on his shoulders. He had seen her world, or at least a vision of it, and the truth she shared had shaken him to the core. An entire species was on the brink of extinction, and somehow he was the one who could help them. He glanced at Sereth, who watched him with a calm, expectant expression. It was clear she wasn't going to rush him, but she was waiting for his decision, waiting for him to make the choice that would change everything. "I don't know, Sereth," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. "This all feels impossible. I'm just a regular guy. How can my emotions, my memories, save your people?" Sereth took a step closer, her violet eyes unwavering. "You're not just a regular guy, Mark. You're the one who holds the key to our survival. Your emotions, your experiences, they resonate deeply. My people have lost that, and that's why we've come to you." Mark shook his head. "I don't get it. You want me to? What? Feel things so deeply that it'll somehow save your entire species? It doesn't make sense." Sereth nodded. "I understand that it's difficult to accept, but think of it this way. Your emotions, Mark, are like a bridge. They can connect us to what we've lost. We can use your resonance to stabilize our people's fading connection to their own emotions. It's a delicate process, and it's not without risks, but it's the only chance we have." Mark crossed his arms, thinking deeply. The idea felt absurd, yet a small part of him knew that something inside him had already started to change. He had never been one to believe in fate or destiny, but standing there with Sereth, something felt undeniably real about it all. "And what do I get out of this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant to voice the question. Sereth paused for a moment, her gaze steady and unwavering. "What you get, Mark, is the opportunity to change not just my people's future, but your own. Imagine the possibilities, the knowledge, the advancements, the power that could come from this. My people, if we succeed, could share our wisdom with humanity. We could help Earth in ways you can't even imagine." Mark looked down at the ground, trying to wrap his mind around it all. Could this really be happening? Could he really help an entire alien species regain what they had lost? The idea seemed too big to grasp. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sereth's expression softened. "If you refuse, we may not survive. The fade is spreading too fast. Without your help, my people will be lost, and the knowledge we have will vanish forever. Your refusal could doom us all." Mark felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. There was no easy answer, no way to walk away from this. He had always played it safe, kept his head down, and avoided getting involved in things that didn't directly affect him. But now, it seemed as though the fate of an entire species, and possibly humanity itself, rested in his hands. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Mark said quietly, looking up at Sereth. You don't have to be ready, Mark, Sereth said, her voice gentle. You just have to be willing to try, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Mark let out a slow breath, the enormity of the decision weighing heavily on him. But in the end, he knew that some choices weren't about being ready. They were about stepping forward when the world asked something of you. With a reluctant but determined nod, Mark made his decision. All right, I'll help, but I need to know what I'm getting into. Sereth smiled, her eyes full of gratitude. I'll explain everything, Mark. And together, we'll do this. For the first time since meeting Sereth, Mark felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something extraordinary. Mark stood in the middle of the quiet forest, feeling more uncertain than ever. The weight of his decision to help Sereth was starting to settle in. How could he be sure this wasn't some elaborate trick? He didn't know anything about aliens or psychic energy, and yet here he was, about to risk his future, and possibly his life, to help someone he barely understood. Sereth noticed the hesitation in his eyes. She stepped closer, her expression calm but filled with understanding. You're still unsure. I can see it in your thoughts. Mark crossed his arms, not wanting to admit how nervous he really was. How do I know this isn't some kind of manipulation? How do I know you're telling the truth about all of this? Sereth nodded, her gaze steady. I understand your doubts. It's a lot to ask of you, Mark, but I can prove that I'm not lying. If you're willing, I can show you something that will make you believe. Mark was silent for a moment, his mind racing. What did she mean by that? Was he ready to see whatever she was offering? All right, he said, his voice tense. Show me. Sereth's eyes glowed slightly, and she reached out to touch his hand. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, Mark felt a jolt, almost like an electric shock. His entire body stiffened, but he didn't pull away. He had to know the truth. In the blink of an eye, the world around them changed again. Mark found himself standing in a place that felt wrong. The sky was dark and thick with swirling clouds, and the ground was cracked and lifeless. The air felt heavy, as though it were pressing in on him from all sides. This is the result of the fade, Sereth said, her voice filled with a deep sadness. This is what happens to our world, to our people, when we lose our connection to emotion. Mark looked around in horror. He had seen the beauty of Sereth's world before, but this was something else entirely. The land was barren, the cities in ruins, and the once shimmering towers were now just skeletons of what they had been. This is what's coming if we fail, Mark, Sereth continued, her voice a whisper. It's not just the Inari who will suffer. The fade spreads. It reaches out, and it takes everything in its path. If we lose our connection to emotion completely, we lose our ability to feel, to connect. And it's not just the Inari who will be lost. Mark's throat tightened as the weight of her words hit him. He could feel the hopelessness in the air, the cold emptiness that had overtaken the once thriving world. It was more than just a physical decay. It was as though the very soul of the planet had been drained. Is this what you're trying to stop? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sereth nodded. This is what awaits us. This is the price of losing our emotions, of losing the very thing that makes us alive. Mark could feel a tight knot in his chest, a mixture of fear and empathy. He had always believed in the importance of connection, of human connection, but to see this, it was too much. Before he could respond, Sereth's voice echoed in his mind. I need you to trust me, Mark. This is the only way. Your emotions can save us, but only if you're willing to believe in them, in yourself. Mark's eyes widened. She was inside his mind now, speaking to him directly. The connection between them was deep, undeniable. He exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. He had seen enough to understand the stakes. He could walk away, live his life as it was, or he could step forward, trust Sereth, and take a chance on something he couldn't fully understand. I'm ready, Mark said finally, his voice firm. I trust you, Sereth. Let's do this. Sereth's expression softened, and for the first time, Mark saw something truly hopeful in her eyes. Thank you, Mark. You've made the right choice. With that, the dark world around them began to fade, and Mark found himself back in the forest, standing with Sereth. But this time, something had changed. He could feel it, an unspoken bond between them, stronger than ever before. It was time to begin. The air was thick with tension as Mark and Sereth walked deeper into the forest, the weight of their decision hanging between them. The images of her ruined world still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of what was at stake. But even with that understanding, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, something he couldn't prepare for. Sereth had been quiet since their connection in the ruined world, her expression serious. Mark didn't ask, but he could tell she was worried. Something's wrong, isn't it? He finally asked, his voice low, filled with unease. Sereth paused, her eyes scanning the trees around them. She didn't answer immediately, but Mark noticed the tension in her posture. Then, with a quiet sigh, she spoke. We're being followed, she said, her voice calm but sharp. Not by just anyone. It's the rogue faction of the Enari. Mark felt his stomach twist. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in the middle of some alien civil war. What do they want with us? They don't agree with what I'm trying to do, Sereth replied, her gaze hardening. They believe that the fade is irreversible, that we should let it take us. They see my plan as dangerous, and they won't hesitate to stop us. A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. He could feel the weight of her words. These weren't just random enemies. They were the remnants of Sereth's own people, ones who didn't believe in hope anymore. And if they were hunting them, it meant they were willing to go to any length to prevent Sereth's mission from succeeding. We can't stay here, Mark said, his voice tight. Sereth nodded. I'll try to mask our trail. We need to move quickly. They moved quickly through the forest, the underbrush crunching beneath their feet. Mark's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was nowhere to run to. He could feel Sereth's presence beside him, her calm, steady energy giving him some reassurance. But deep down, he knew they were in real danger. After what felt like hours of walking, Sereth stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Mark immediately tensed, instinctively lowering his body into a more defensive stance. They're close, Sereth whispered. We need to find cover. Mark's heart pounded as they moved off the path and into the thicker part of the forest. He tried to keep his breathing steady, his eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in on them. Sereth crouched beside a large rock and gestured for Mark to do the same. Stay quiet, she murmured, her voice barely audible. They both huddled in the shadows, barely daring to move. Mark's eyes strained to catch any sign of the enemy, but all he saw were the dark shapes of trees, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. His pulse was racing, his mind on high alert. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Just as Mark thought he couldn't stay still any longer, Sereth's sharp eyes locked onto something in the distance. There, she whispered, her voice tight. Mark followed her gaze. There, hidden in the trees, were figures moving silently, alien figures, their cloaked forms blending into the shadows. Mark could see the distinct markings on their bodies, the same as Sereth's people. But these weren't the peaceful Enari. These were the rogue faction, and they were getting closer. We need to act fast, Sereth whispered urgently. When I say go, run. Mark nodded, every muscle in his body tense and ready. This was it. There was no more time to hesitate. Go. Sereth's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Without a second thought, Mark sprinted into the forest, Sereth right beside him. The sound of their pursuers chasing after them sent a surge of adrenaline through Mark's veins. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. As they ran through the trees, Mark realized something. He wasn't just running from danger. He was running towards something bigger than he had ever imagined. Something that could change everything. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted through the forest, the sound of heavy footsteps behind him growing louder with each passing second. He didn't know how much longer he could keep running. The rogue Inari were fast, and their advanced technology made them almost impossible to escape. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Sereth's mission was more important than ever. Sereth, despite the danger, seemed unfazed. Her steps were steady, her focus unshaken. Mark had always been the type to worry, to think of every possible outcome, but with Sereth beside him, he felt an odd sense of calm. She wasn't just running for her people's survival, she was running for something even bigger, and he was part of it now. They rounded a sharp bend in the path, and Sereth suddenly stopped, pulling Mark to a halt with a firm grip on his arm. "They're too close," she whispered, her breath steady despite the exertion. "We need to hide." Mark barely had time to react before Sereth gestured to a cluster of thick bushes nearby. They ducked into the cover, their bodies pressed close together, as the sound of their pursuers grew nearer. The rogue Inari weren't far behind, their voices a low murmur, discussing their plans to capture them. Mark could barely breathe, his pulse racing as the enemies moved past their hiding spot. His eyes met Sereth's, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of fear in her gaze. She didn't show it often, but in that moment, Mark understood. This wasn't just about saving her people, it was about survival for them both. They waited, the forest around them eerily silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Mark's mind raced, replaying everything that had happened so far. He had never asked to be part of this, never asked for any of this to happen. And yet, here he was, running for his life alongside an alien woman, caught up in a mission that seemed impossible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rogue Inari moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. "We're safe for now," Sereth said softly, her voice calm once again. "But they'll be back. We don't have much time." Mark nodded, trying to steady his breathing. "So, what now?" Sereth didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the sky, her face thoughtful. After a moment, she looked back at him, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I told you before, Mark, that you're important. But there's more you need to understand." Mark raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Sereth took a deep breath before speaking. "I didn't tell you everything about why I chose you, why I came to Earth. It's not just about saving my people. It's about saving the universe itself." Mark blinked, his mind struggling to keep up with the sudden revelation. "The universe? What are you talking about?" Sereth's eyes darkened as she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a force in the universe that feeds on the fade. It's what caused the destruction of countless civilizations before ours. The rogue Inari who are chasing us. They're not just trying to stop me. They're trying to make sure this force remains free to destroy everything." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a mission to save her people, it was a fight for the survival of everything. "I never wanted you to get involved in all of this," Sereth continued, her voice soft but firm. "But now that you are, we have no choice. You are the key, Mark. Your emotions, the depth of your feelings. They're what can stop this force. Only you can help us." Mark felt a surge of disbelief, followed by a deep sense of responsibility. He had thought he was just helping an alien woman. Now he understood that this was something far greater. And as much as he wanted to walk away, to go back to his simple life, he knew he couldn't. He was already too far in. "I'll do whatever it takes," Mark said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. Sereth nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper, a connection that he couldn't explain. "We're not alone in this," Sereth said softly. "We never have been." Mark didn't know what lay ahead, But one thing was certain. He was in this fight to the end. The days that followed were tense. Mark and Sereth kept moving, always one step ahead of the rogue Inari faction. Every shadow seemed to hold danger, and every sound in the distance made Mark's heart race. But despite the constant threat, there was something else growing between him and Sereth. It wasn't just a partnership anymore. It was something deeper. They had come to a crossroads in their journey, a moment where everything they had worked for was about to be tested. They had reached the edge of a remote village, one that, Sereth assured him, was a safe haven. It was a place where she had hidden out before, a place where they could rest and plan their next move. But Mark wasn't sure if safety was something they could afford anymore. His mind kept going back to the rogue Inari. How long before they caught up to them? How long before they were trapped? Sereth seemed to sense his unease. She had been quiet for most of the walk, her steps soft but determined. Finally, she turned to him. "You're worried," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. "I can feel it." Mark nodded, not hiding his thoughts. "How much longer can we keep running? They're relentless, and I don't know how much more of this I can take. I don't even know what's at stake anymore. I don't understand what you need me to do." Sereth paused, her gaze softening. "You're already doing more than you realize, Mark. You've been with me through every step of this journey, and you've trusted me even when everything felt impossible." Mark shook his head. "I'm not sure I can trust myself anymore." Sereth placed a hand on his arm, her touch comforting. "You're not alone in this, and no matter how hard it gets, you don't have to face it by yourself." Mark met her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of everything on his shoulders. She was right. He wasn't alone anymore. They continued walking toward the village, but Mark's mind was still racing. He had always been the kind of person who avoided making big decisions, who kept things simple. But this was bigger than anything he had ever faced. "We're at a crossroads, Mark," Sereth said, her voice low but filled with purpose. "And I need you to make a choice." Mark looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in. "What do you mean?" Sereth stopped walking and turned to face him. "The rogue Inari aren't just hunting us. They're hunting you too. They know what you can do, what you're capable of. If we keep running, we'll eventually be cornered. But if you stand with me, if you help me unlock the power inside you, we can defeat them. We can stop the fade from spreading. But that will require everything you have, Mark. It will require your trust, your belief in yourself, and in us." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. He had always been the cautious type. But now, it wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, something that could save worlds, that could prevent an unstoppable force from consuming everything. "Are you asking me to fight?" Mark asked quietly. Sereth's eyes softened. "Yes, but it's not just about fighting with your strength. It's about fighting with your heart. Your emotions. They're the key. You have to believe in them. Believe in their power." Mark took a deep breath. He had spent so much of his life hiding from his feelings, ignoring them. But now, Sereth was asking him to embrace them, to use them for something bigger than himself. He knew what he had to do. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, his resolve hardening. "I'll help you. I'll stand with you." Sereth smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. "Thank you, Mark. This is the beginning of something extraordinary." The weight of his decision settled over him, but it wasn't fear that he felt. It was something else, something that felt like purpose. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for the future, and Mark was ready. The crossroads had led him here, and now there was no turning back. The night was thick with tension as Mark and Sereth moved deeper into the heart of the village. Their footsteps were soft on the dirt road, but each step felt like a drumbeat, echoing their approach to something inevitable. Mark could feel the weight of his decision pressing against him. He had committed. There was no turning back now. Sereth had led him to this hidden place, but even here, the threat of the rogue Inari loomed large. He had thought they could rest, regroup, but Sirith's warning echoed in his mind. They'll be coming. We don't have much time. And she was right. As they approached the secluded building on the edge of the village, a harsh noise shattered the stillness. Voices. Mark's heart skipped a beat. They were here. The rogue Inari had tracked them down. Hide, Sereth whispered, pulling him toward a narrow alley. Mark barely had time to react before he was pressed against a cold stone wall. He could feel the pulse of his heartbeat in his throat, his mind racing with thoughts of what was coming. They had no more time to run. This was it. From their hiding spot, Mark could see the flickering shadows of their pursuers. A small group of rogue Inari, their forms cloaked under dark hoods, moved swiftly through the village, searching for them. The anger and determination in their movements were unmistakable. They're close, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sereth nodded, her expression set in grim determination. I'll handle them. You stay back. Mark wanted to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She was right. She was their best chance, but there was no way he could just stand by and do nothing. He wasn't going to be the one left behind. Not now. Before he could make a move, Sereth stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a soft violet light. She raised her hands, and the air around them seemed to shimmer with energy. Mark had seen her do this before, but never like this, never with such intensity. The rogue Inari paused as Sereth's presence washed over them. Mark could see the surprise flicker in their eyes as they realized something was wrong. They had expected an easy hunt, but now they were facing something they couldn't understand. Stop right there, Sereth commanded, her voice calm but filled with power. The rogue Inari hesitated, clearly taken aback by the strength in her words. They hadn't anticipated Sereth being so confident, so ready to face them. Mark could feel the energy in the air, a palpable force that seemed to shift with every breath. He wasn't sure what Sereth was planning, but he could tell it was going to be something big. Then one of the rogue Inari moved, drawing a weapon from beneath his cloak. The weapon glowed with a dark energy, and in an instant the fight began. Sereth moved quickly, her body a blur as she dodged the first strike. Mark watched in awe as she deflected the blow with a swift motion of her hand, her eyes never leaving her enemies. It was clear this wasn't just a fight to her. This was the culmination of everything she had been working toward. The rogue Inari closed in, but Sereth was too fast, too powerful. She used her emotions, her connection to Mark's own resonance, to amplify her strength. The rogue Inari faltered, and Mark could see their confusion. They were no match for her. But then, one of the enemies made a move that Mark hadn't anticipated. He reached out with a strange device and activated it, sending a shockwave through the air. The energy in the village shifted, and for a moment, everything felt like it was about to collapse. Mark's pulse quickened. This was it. They needed to end this now. Sereth, he shouted, rushing toward her. She turned toward him, her expression fierce. Mark, stay back. But Mark couldn't. He wasn't going to let Sereth face this alone, not after everything they had been through. He pushed forward, his emotions, his fear, his anger, filling him with strength he didn't know he had. In that moment, something clicked. The connection between him and Sereth, between their emotions, became stronger, sharper. Mark could feel his own energy flowing into her, empowering her in ways he couldn't fully understand. It was like they were two parts of the same force. Together, they faced the rogue Inari, their combined strength unstoppable. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. The rogue Inari, overwhelmed by their unity, began to retreat, their confidence shattered. The fight was over. For now, at least. Mark stood beside Sereth, breathless, his body trembling from the adrenaline. They had won, but at what cost? The road ahead was still uncertain, and the threat was far from over. But for the first time, Mark didn't feel afraid. Together, they could face anything. The village was quiet now, the dust from the battle settling into the air. Mark stood alongside Sereth, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The rogue Inari had been driven back, defeated, at least for now. But that didn't mean the war was over. The mission, the stakes, were still as high as ever. Mark could feel the rush of emotions. Relief, fear, and something else. Something stronger. For the first time, he felt truly alive. The connection between him and Sereth, the power that had surged between them in the heat of battle, was something he could never have imagined. But it wasn't just the fight that had changed him. It was everything. "You did it," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with awe. He looked over at Sereth, who was standing still, her eyes scanning the horizon. Sereth's gaze softened as she met his eyes. "We did it, Mark. You were the one who gave me the strength to push through." Mark shook his head, still trying to make sense of it all. "I didn't do anything. You're the one who saved us. You're the one who fought." Sereth smiled, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "But you're wrong. You gave me more than just your presence, Mark. You gave me your emotions, your courage, your heart. That's what made the difference." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent his life hiding from his feelings, keeping things under control. But with Sereth, everything was different. He had let go, and it felt freeing. They stood there for a few moments, the silence between them comfortable, yet filled with understanding. Finally, Sereth broke it. "We can't stop now," she said softly. "This was just one battle. The rogue Inari won't give up, and the fade is still spreading. We have to keep moving forward." Mark nodded, his determination growing. "I know. I'm ready." Sereth's eyes shone with pride. "I knew you were. There's a lot more ahead of us, but I believe we can do it. Together." As they turned to leave, Mark couldn't help but feel that something had shifted inside him. The weight of the world might still be on their shoulders, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of something much bigger than himself, something worth fighting for. The path ahead was unclear, and the challenges would only grow tougher. But Mark wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his place in this strange new world. He had found purpose, and he had found Sereth. "We're not just fighting for the Inari anymore," Mark said as they walked together through the village. "We're fighting for all of us." Sereth smiled, a look of quiet determination in her eyes. "Yes, for all of us." And with that they stepped into the unknown, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt ready. Ready for whatever came next. Together, they would change the course of the universe.